The crystal vase shattered against the marble wall, missing Maria's head by inches. Glass exploded across Italian travertine worth more than most people earned in a year. Dr. Marcus Whitmore stood in his study doorway, blood dripping from his fist where he'd crushed a champagne flute, the expensive cristal mixing with red on his Persian rug. Maria Santos remained frozen 3 steps inside the room, fresh linens folded over her arm, her face carefully blank. Her uniform collar held a voice-activated recording device. Whitmore didn't see it, didn't notice her tactical positioning, weight balanced on both feet, exit route already calculated. Didn't realize the woman he'd humiliated for 6 months wore an FBI badge under her housekeeper's uniform. By sunrise, federal agents would own every key to his pharmaceutical empire. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story grips you, like the video and subscribe now. November in Boston's Back Bay didn't arrive with kindness. It came cold and gray, the kind of weather that made historic brownstones look less charming and more oppressive, their brick facades dark with moisture, their windows reflecting nothing but clouded sky. The old money neighborhood sat quiet this Tuesday morning, its tree-lined streets empty except for dog walkers and the occasional Blacktown car. Behind ornate iron gates and manicured hedges, wealth accumulated silently, protected by privacy and the unspoken understanding that certain people operated by different rules. Marcus Whitmore's mansion occupied a corner lot on Commonwealth Avenue, for stories of limestone and arrogance. The building had cost him $12 million 3 years ago, not because he loved architecture, but because owning property here meant something. Inside, every surface announced money. Marble imported from Italy at $40,000 per ton covered the foyer floor. A Basquiat original hung in the study beside a Warhol he'd purchased at auction without ever learning the artist's actual significance. First edition Hemingway and Fitzgerald lined mahogany shelves, books he'd never read, purchased by the yard through an interior designer who understood that wealthy men wanted the appearance of culture without the inconvenience of actually acquiring it. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with Swiss precision, its sound echoing through rooms that felt too large, too cold, too carefully staged. Expensive cologne mixed with the scent of Macallan Scotch and furniture polish in the air, sterile despite the climate control set to exactly 72 degrees. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlook Commonwealth Avenue Center Mall, their glass so clean it seemed invisible, offering views Whitmore never noticed. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their light harsh even on gray mornings. Everything gleamed. Everything cost more than it needed to. Everything screamed wealth without taste, power without purpose. The mansion's architecture created its own hierarchy. Staff quarters occupied the 4th floor, small rooms with slanted ceilings and narrow windows, accessed by a separate staircase. The main house sprawled below, its proportions designed to make people feel small. Whitmore's study commanded the 2nd floor southeast corner, positioned so he could watch both the street and the side entrance where staff came and went. From this room, he'd built prescient pharmaceuticals. From this room, he'd made decisions that ended lives while calling it business. 3 floors below the mansion, parked a Comcast installation truck that hadn't moved in 6 months. Special Agent Jennifer Morrison monitored equipment that tracked every sound in Whitmore's study. The van's windows were tinted dark. Satellite equipment on the roof looked official enough that neighbors never questioned it. Inside, Morrison watched audio waveforms spike and fall, recording everything, waiting for the moment Maria's panic button activated. This was Tuesday morning, 6 months into Maria Santos's placement in Whitmore's household. Yesterday, he'd received an email that cracked his carefully constructed world. Tomorrow, FBI teams would execute coordinated raids across 7 locations. But right now, in this moment, Marcus Whitmore still believed he controlled everything. He was wrong. Dr. Marcus Jonathan Whitmore turned 52 last month. His birthday party cost $60,000 and was attended by people who smiled at him while calculating how his pharmaceutical company's stock price affected their portfolios. At 6 feet tall, he should have carried himself with natural authority, but pharmaceutical cocktails and scotch had bloated him, thickening his middle, softening his jawline, turning his face ruddy with burst capillaries that mapped his cheeks like tiny rivers. His Brioni suits were custom-tailored to hide the damage, their Italian wool expensive enough to almost succeed. His thinning hair was expensively maintained, colored and cut every 2 weeks at a Newbury Street salon where they called him doctor and pretended his tips were generous. His hands had never done labor. They were manicured weekly, soft except where he gripped his golf clubs, the nails perfectly shaped. These hands signed documents that falsified clinical trial data. These hands crushed champagne flutes when panicked. These hands grabbed women by the wrist and squeezed hard enough to leave marks that faded before anyone could photograph them. His eyes calculated profit in human suffering. When he looked at people, he saw numbers, what they cost, what they were worth, whether they served his purpose. Employees were expenses. Household staff were furniture that occasionally malfunctioned. The patients in his clinical trials were data points, acceptable losses in pursuit of FDA approval and shareholder value. He learned early that the right attorney could make almost anything disappear, that the right campaign contribution could redirect almost any investigation. He carried himself with the posture of a man who'd never been told no, who'd never faced consequences that money and connections couldn't erase, who'd fired 19 household staff members in 18 months and slept soundly every night. The pattern was documented, though Whitmore didn't know it yet. 19 women, all black or Latina, all terminated for infractions that evaporated under examination. Coffee too hot, vacuum too loud, laundry folded incorrectly, windows cleaned with streaks only Whitmore could see. Each woman received the same treatment, screamed at, demeaned, threatened, then fired. Each received a settlement check with an NDA attached. Each signed, needing the money more than justice, knowing that fighting a man with Whitmore's resources meant losing everything. None filed police reports. How could they? The police chief's daughter worked in Prescient Pharmaceuticals' legal department. She'd been hired right out of Boston College Law. Her starting salary twice what public defenders made. Her position secured by connections rather than competence. 3 Superior Court judges in Massachusetts received campaign contributions that flowed through Whitmore's shell corporations, money laundered through political action committees and charity foundations, technically legal, functionally corrupt. His attorneys didn't just defend him. They erased problems before problems became public. Settlement agreements were sealed. Court records disappeared. Women who considered speaking out received visits from lawyers carrying thick folders of personal information, addresses, family members, immigration statuses, debts. The message was clear. Silence was cheaper than resistance. Whitmore had built Prescient Pharmaceuticals on clinical trials he never ran and patents he stole from researchers who trusted him. The company's flagship drug, Prescient 7, was approved by the FDA based on data from Study 447, conducted at a facility in Miami. The study claimed 0 patient deaths and remarkable efficacy rates. The real numbers, locked in a safe in that Miami facility, told a different story. 127 patients enrolled in the trial. 127 patients died or suffered catastrophic adverse events. Every death certificate was altered. Every autopsy report was falsified. Every family was paid to stay quiet. Whitmore didn't consider this murder. He considered it acceptable risk the cost of accelerating the approval process, the necessary sacrifice for shareholder value, and his own compensation package worth $43 million last year. He owned Elite Domestic Services, the staffing agency that placed housekeepers, nannies, and drivers in Boston's wealthy homes. This wasn't public knowledge. The company was registered to one of his shell corporations. Owning the agency meant controlling the narrative. When he fired staff, he controlled their references, their future employment, their ability to work in any wealthy household in the city. It was leverage disguised as business, power exercised through proxies. Yesterday morning changed everything. Though Whitmore didn't understand it yet, the email arrived at 9:47 a.m. No subject line. Sender address was a string of random characters routed through servers in Estonia. The message contained one sentence. Trial 447, Miami facility. We have the real autopsy reports. Whitmore's hands were shaking when he hurled his laptop against the study wall. The MacBook Pro struck the Basquiat painting, its screen spiderwebbing across the canvas that cost $800,000 at Christie's. The laptop fell, bounced off his leather desk, and landed on the Persian rug. Whitmore followed it, screaming at the broken device like it could answer his questions. Who sent this? How did they access sealed facilities? What else did they know? Those patients were terminal anyway. He screamed it at the cracked screen, at the empty room, at the fear clawing up his throat. They were going to die. In the hallway outside, Maria Santos was vacuuming. The motor's hum was loud enough to mask her movements, but quiet enough that her recording collar captured every word Whitmore screamed. The collar looked like decorative stitching along her uniform's neckline, the kind of detail wealthy people expected from good help. The camera lens was smaller than a pinhole. The microphone was voice-activated, triggered by volume and tone, designed to filter out background noise and capture clear audio of conversations and confessions. Whitmore's confession, his admission that patients were terminal, his implicit acknowledgement that he knew about the deaths, was now recorded on federal servers, encrypted, time-stamped, admissible in court. Maria didn't stop vacuuming, didn't react, didn't change her expression or her pace. She'd been trained for this, had practiced maintaining her cover while documenting evidence that would destroy the people she served. But her finger moved, subtle and precise, pressing a button hidden inside the vacuum's handle. The signal transmitted to Morrison's van 3 floors below. Evidence captured. Subject agitated. Maintained surveillance. Whitmore turned toward the study doorway. His eyes found Maria like she'd materialized from his guilty conscience, like she'd appeared specifically to witness his panic. She stood there holding the vacuum, her face professionally blank, her posture deferential, everything about her screaming harmless, invisible, unimportant. His paranoia transformed her into a threat. How long have you been standing there? His voice carried accusation she hadn't earned. Yet, Maria Santos was 30 years old, though she'd spent 6 months pretending to be 35, the age listed on her forged employment documents. She was a black woman from Detroit, born to parents who understood the mathematics of survival in America. Her father had worked assembly lines at Ford until the plant closed, his hands thick with calluses and scars from 30 years of repetitive motion. Her mother cleaned offices in the Renaissance Center, working nights, moving through corporate spaces after the executives went home, becoming invisible in the same way Maria had learned to disappear. She'd grown up watching how invisible people became when they wore service uniforms, how executives talked freely in front of janitors, how security guards gossiped near cleaning crews, assuming the people emptying trash didn't understand English or wouldn't remember details or simply didn't matter. Maria learned early that invisibility was sometimes chosen, sometimes tactical, sometimes the most powerful position in any room. At 18, she joined the military. The recruiter's office in Detroit promised education benefits and a way out. What she found instead was structure, discipline, and the discovery that she had a gift for observation. She noticed details others missed, remembered conversations word for word, could maintain cover stories under pressure that broke other recruits. By 22, she was working intelligence. By 26, the FBI recruited her for Financial Crimes Division, specifically for long-term undercover operations in domestic settings. This was her fourth assignment, the longest, the most dangerous. 6 months ago, Maria Santos, who wasn't named Maria Santos, whose real name was locked in personnel files she couldn't access herself, applied for a position through Elite Domestic Services. Her resume was perfect. 3 years working for a family in Greenwich, excellent references, all from FBI-controlled phone numbers, impeccable skills, no criminal record. The minor arrests planted in her background check were designed to make her seem authentic, vulnerable, someone Whitmore could intimidate. Her hands were deliberately calloused with pumice stone, roughened until they looked like hands that scrubbed floors for years. Her posture was carefully submissive, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes that looked down when addressed, the body language of someone accustomed to making themselves smaller. She cut her hair shorter, worn clothing that made her look older, practiced an accent that suggested education interrupted, opportunity limited. When she interviewed with Elite Domestic Services, she performed deference perfectly. "Yes, ma'am. Of course, sir. I understand. Whatever you need." The agency hired her immediately and placed her in Whitmore's household within 48 hours. Whitmore never questioned her credentials. He barely looked at her during her first week. She was furniture that occasionally moved, hands that folded his monogrammed sheets and scrubbed his marble floors. He didn't notice that she never turned her back to doorways, didn't see how she positioned her cleaning cart to block sight lines while she photographed documents, didn't realize she'd mapped every camera angle in his supposedly sophisticated security system within 3 days. Her uniform collar contained 3 recording devices, each activated by different triggers. Voice activation for conversations, manual button for specific moments, automatic recording when her heart rate spiked above 140 beats per minute. The FBI's way of ensuring evidence survived if an operation went catastrophically wrong. The devices were sewn into the collar's lining by technicians who specialized in covert equipment, their work invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it with the right tools. The encrypted phone was hidden inside a Lysol bottle under Whitmore's kitchen sink. The container weighted correctly, the liquid authentic enough to pass casual inspection. The phone connected to a secure server that existed nowhere and everywhere, its data backed up in real time to locations Whitmore's attorneys couldn't subpoena because they didn't know which jurisdiction to target. Maria photographed documents reflected in windows while she polished glass. The technique required practice. Angle the glass cleaner spray just right, position herself so the window became a mirror, use the camera hidden in her watch to capture the reflection. She'd spent 2 months mapping Whitmore's routine, learning when he left documents on his desk, when he stepped away during phone calls, when he was drunk enough to leave his laptop unlocked. She timed her vacuuming to cover conversations she was recording, positioned furniture to create acoustic dead zones where Whitmore felt safe speaking freely, left cleaning supplies in strategic locations so she always had an excuse to be near his study, his office, his phone calls. For 6 months, she'd been building a federal case while answering to Maria and saying yes, sir, and scrubbing toilets that didn't need scrubbing. First month, establish routine. Earn trust through perfect invisibility. Learn the household's rhythm. Identify where Whitmore kept sensitive documents. Map his security system's blind spots. Document his treatment of staff, the casual cruelty, the screaming, the threats. Second month, identify document locations. Whitmore kept hard copies of everything despite his attorney's advice. His study contained filing cabinets labeled with offshore account names. His safe combination was written on a sticky note in his desk drawer. Arrogance disguised as confidence. Maria photographed every document she could access without triggering security alerts. Third month, begin photographing financial records. Shell corporations in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Panama. Money moving through networks designed to obscure its origins. Campaign contributions masked as charitable donations. Payments to judges' family members disguised as consulting fees. Fourth month, discover the Miami facility connection. A phone call Whitmore took at 2 a.m., drunk and careless. He'd screamed at someone named Rodriguez, demanding to know why autopsy reports were being stored instead of destroyed. Maria recorded every word. Began researching Study 447. Fifth month, find evidence of patient deaths. Whitmore kept a locked drawer in his bedroom closet. Maria picked the lock using skills taught in a facility in Virginia that didn't officially exist. Inside, USB drives labeled with dates corresponding to the Miami study. She copied every file. 127 patient names. 127 falsified death certificates. 127 families paid to stay silent. Sixth month, build the case for federal prosecution. Compile evidence. Cross-reference financial records with patient deaths. Document patterns. Prepare witness lists. Coordinate with Morrison's team for synchronized raids. This morning, when Whitmore's eyes landed on her in the doorway, Maria's training took over. Her face remained blank. Her body language stayed submissive. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no threat. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, I understand completely. But behind her back, hidden by her body, her finger pressed the panic button sewn into her apron's inner seam. The signal transmitted instantly. 3 floors below, in the surveillance van disguised as a Comcast truck, Special Agent Jennifer Morrison received the alert. Code yellow. Subject agitated. Possible escalation. Stand by. Morrison's hand moved to her radio. All units, code yellow. Maintain positions. Outside Whitmore's mansion, 3 black Chevy Suburbans were already rolling through the morning traffic, their destination programmed, their arrival timed, their occupants ready. No sirens, no lights, just the quiet confidence of federal authority executing a plan 6 months in the making. But Whitmore didn't hear them coming. He was too focused on Maria, on the paranoia crawling through his brain, on the certainty that she'd heard too much, knew too much, represented a threat he needed to eliminate immediately. He crossed the study in 4 strides. Whitmore's expensive Italian loafers crushed laptop fragments as he moved, plastic and glass grinding against marble. He grabbed Maria's wrist before she could step back, his grip tight enough to bruise, pressure calibrated through years of practice, hard enough to terrify, controlled enough not to leave marks visible to cameras he believed were the only witnesses. His manicured fingers dug into her skin. She could smell his breath, Macallan and desperation mixing into something sour and afraid. You don't repeat what you hear in this house. His voice was low, meant to be threatening, but fear made it crack at the edges. Ever. Do you understand me? Maria met his gaze without flinching. This moment had been rehearsed in FBI training facilities, practiced until maintaining cover under physical threat became muscle memory. Her face showed the right amount of fear, enough to convince him he was winning, not enough to trigger his suspicion that fear could be performed. Her voice stayed soft, deferential, every word chosen to feed his ego and his false sense of control. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, I understand completely. Behind her back, where Whitmore couldn't see, her free hand moved with precision born from hundreds of practice repetitions. Her finger found the panic button sewn into her apron's inner seam and pressed. Once, twice, 3 times. The signal transmitted through fabric and air to equipment 3 floors below. Code red. Physical contact. Assault in progress. Move now. In the surveillance van, Morrison's screen flashed red. Audio spiked. Maria's heart rate monitor showed 152 beats per minute and climbing. Morrison grabbed her radio with one hand, her service weapon with the other. All units, code red. Execute now. Repeat, execute now. But Morrison's team was still 7 minutes away. 7 minutes of Boston traffic. 7 minutes of Maria alone with a man whose paranoia was escalating into violence. Something in Maria's steady calm ignited Whitmore's rage. Perhaps it was her refusal to look away. Perhaps it was the absence of the trembling fear he expected from women he grabbed. Perhaps it was his own terror finding a target, transforming his panic into violence, because violence was the language power spoke when control slipped away. He shoved her backward into the bookshelf. Maria's shoulders struck mahogany with a sound that echoed through the study. First editions crashed around her. Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Books Whitmore had never read, purchased by the Yard through an interior designer who billed him $40,000 to create the illusion of culture. A silver-framed photograph fell from the shelf above her head, glass shattering as it hit marble. The photo showed Whitmore shaking hands with Senator Elizabeth Warren at a pharmaceutical industry fundraiser, both of them smiling for cameras while discussing policy positions that would kill the very regulations designed to prevent tragedies like Study 447. Whitmore advanced again. His finger jabbed toward Maria's face, close enough that she could see the tremor in his hand, the way fear made his whole body shake even as he tried to project dominance. Maybe I need a new housekeeper. The words came fast, sharp, ugly. Someone who knows her goddamn place. The threat wasn't subtle. Whitmore had fired 19 women before Maria. Each termination followed the same pattern. Manufactured infraction, public humiliation, immediate dismissal. No references. No severance beyond the settlement check. No way to work in any wealthy household in Boston, once Elite Domestic Services, his company. Flagged them as problematic. Maria straightened slowly, carefully, her movements deliberate. She brushed leather, binding fragments from her uniform, her hands steady despite her elevated heart rate, her face showing resignation that looked authentic because it was partially real. She was resigned, not to defeat, but to the necessity of maintaining cover for 7 more minutes. 7 minutes until Morrison's team arrived. 7 minutes of performing submission while recording evidence that would destroy him. Of course, sir. She kept her voice quiet, defeated, exactly what he expected to hear. I'll collect my belongings immediately. She turned toward the service entrance, the narrow staircase that led to 4th-floor staff quarters, where her belongings waited in a room she'd occupied for 6 months. Room 4C, 10 feet by 12 feet, a twin bed and a small dresser, and a window that overlooked the alley where trash was collected every Tuesday morning. She'd lived there, slept there, existed in that small space while gathering evidence in the mansion below. But she paused at the doorway, turned back slightly, let her shoulders slump a fraction more, selling the defeat, making him believe he'd won. Though you should know. Her voice was hesitant now, almost apologetic, the tone of someone offering information they weren't sure they should share. The staffing agency requires exit interviews for all placements. Standard protocol. They'll want to understand why the employment ended. The color drained from Whitmore's face like water from a broken glass. His skin went from ruddy to pale in seconds, burst capillaries standing out like red threads on snow. His eyes widened. His mouth opened and closed without sound. He understood immediately. He owned Elite Domestic Services, controlled its operations, dictated its policies. But ownership meant paper trails, corporate structures, registered agents, board meetings with minutes that had to be filed. The agency operated under Massachusetts employment law, subject to state oversight, required to maintain records and conduct exit interviews and document terminations. An exit interview meant external documentation, questions he'd have to answer or delegate, a paper trail he couldn't personally erase without exposing his ownership. The possibility that Maria might say something, might mention the email she'd overheard, might trigger an investigation he couldn't control through his usual channels. His paranoia crystallized into certainty. She was a threat that needed to be eliminated immediately, completely, in a way that left no possibility of her speaking to anyone about anything she'd seen or heard in his household. Outside, 3 black Chevy Suburbans rolled through the mansion's iron gates with the quiet confidence of federal authority that didn't need to announce itself. The vehicles moved in formation, their timing synchronized, their occupants trained for exactly this scenario. No sirens, no lights, no warning, just the inevitable arrival of consequences that money and connections had postponed but couldn't prevent forever. Car doors closed with precise synchronization, the sound military in its coordination. Footsteps on travertine, multiple pairs, the cadence unmistakable to anyone with tactical training. Boots, not shoes. The measured pace of people moving with purpose and legal authority. In the foyer, the grandfather clock continued ticking, Swiss precision marking time that was running out. Maria heard the footsteps. Her training taught her to recognize tactical movement, to distinguish between civilian and law enforcement approaches, to calculate arrival times based on vehicle sounds and door closures. Morrison's team was early, 5 minutes instead of 7. Traffic had been lighter than estimated, or they'd used lights and sirens until the final approach, or Morrison had called in additional units to expedite entry. Whitmore heard nothing. He was too focused on Maria, on his rage, on his absolute certainty that he controlled this situation and this woman and every outcome that mattered. He laughed. The sound came sharp and ugly, the laugh of a man grasping at control already gone, not realizing his fingers were closing on empty air. Exit interview? With who? His voice rose, performance for an audience of one, arrogance masking terror. I own Elite Domestic Services, you stupid woman. I own half of Boston. He grabbed his phone from the desk, expensive iPhone in a leather case that cost $200. His thumb moved across the screen, pulling up contacts, ready to call security, ready to make this problem disappear the way he'd made 19 other problems disappear. Security will remove you in handcuffs if I want. The threat was specific now, detailed. The kind of threat he'd used before and seen work. Maybe I'll tell them I caught you stealing. Maybe I'll tell them you threatened me. Maybe you'll spend tonight in a cell trying to explain to immigration why you're in this country. Maria's shoulders slumped further. She looked smaller suddenly, defeated, exactly what he needed to see. Her voice, when she spoke, carried resignation that sounded complete. You're right, Mr. Whitmore. I apologize. She turned fully toward the service entrance now, her back to him, her posture communicating total surrender. I'll leave quietly through the back. For a moment, it seemed like another story of power winning. Another black woman, silenced by a wealthy man who controlled the systems meant to protect her. Another instance of money and connections and institutional capture defeating justice before justice could even begin to organize its case. The study felt heavier. The air seemed thicker. Everything in the room, the expensive furniture, the stolen art, the books never read, seemed to lean toward Whitmore, seemed to confirm his belief that he was untouchable, that he'd won, that control was restored. He believed it completely. Outside, footsteps reached the front entrance. The grandfather clock ticked. Maria's heart rate monitor showed 148 beats per minute, elevated but controlled. Fear managed through breathing techniques and training and the absolute certainty that help was 30 seconds away. Whitmore heard none of it. His attention was fixed on Maria's retreating form, on her defeated posture, on his triumph. The household staff had been watching from various positions throughout the mansion, their presence invisible to Whitmore because he'd trained himself not to see them. Service workers occupied the same mental category as furniture, present but unimportant, functional but forgettable, existing only when they failed to perform their designated tasks. Devin Pierce stood at the kitchen doorway, holding a serving tray he'd forgotten he was carrying. He was 26 years old, a culinary school graduate from Roxbury who'd taken this position 4 months ago, believing that working for a pharmaceutical executive meant contributing to something good, helping people, being part of an organization that developed life-saving medications. He'd learned otherwise within his first week. Devin was African American, the first in his family to attend college, his education financed through student loans that currently totaled $89,000. The debt was constant pressure, a weight that made decisions for him, that transformed should I stay into can I afford to leave. His body was lean from kitchen work, his hands scarred from knives and burns and the 1,000 small injuries that came from professional cooking. But his eyes still expected fairness, still believed, despite 4 months of evidence to the contrary, that systems worked and truth mattered and justice eventually arrived. He'd witnessed 2 firings in his 4 months here. Both had followed the same pattern: manufactured infraction, screaming, immediate termination, settlement check with an NDA attached. He'd watched women he'd shared the staff kitchen with suddenly disappear, their belongings cleared from 4th-floor rooms within hours, their phone numbers disconnected, their futures erased by Whitmore's power and their own desperation for money that came with strings designed to strangle. Devin had maintained small resistances. He left extra food for Maria, remembered staff birthdays, offered coffee during long shifts. These gestures were tiny rebellions against the dehumanization Whitmore cultivated, small ways of asserting that people mattered even when power insisted they didn't. But he'd also stayed silent, accepted his paycheck, avoided eye contact when Whitmore screamed, told himself he couldn't afford to lose this job, couldn't risk his references, couldn't jeopardize his ability to pay rent and loans and the money he sent to his mother every month. Now he stood frozen at the doorway, watching Whitmore shove Maria into the bookshelf, watching her steady response, watching the whole scene unfold with the sick familiarity of something he'd seen before and would see again unless something fundamental changed. His hands gripped the serving tray hard enough that his knuckles turned pale. His jaw clenched. His internal voice, usually so good at rationalizing silence, suddenly offered only one thought. Evidence only matters if it survives. In the garden visible through the study side window, Robert Chin had stopped pretending to prune rose bushes. He stood motionless, pruning shears lowered, his weathered hands steady despite what he was witnessing. Robert was 58 years old, an Asian American man who'd worked for the Whitmore family for 12 years, long enough to serve Marcus's father before him, long enough to watch 3 generations of arrogance accumulate and intensify. He'd been a groundskeeper at MIT before this, tending the campus gardens, watching students and professors move through spaces he maintained. The work paid less than private estate employment, but it had been honest work, free from the moral compromises required in households like this one. Robert had patient eyes, the eyes of a man who'd outlasted many storms by choosing survival over confrontation, silence over truth-telling, endurance over justice. His posture carried the dignity of someone who'd never let degradation touch his core sense of self, even when he had to bow his head and say yes, sir, to men who didn't deserve the title. For 8 years, Robert had kept secrets. A small locked box in his potting shed contained copies of every document Whitmore had ordered him to destroy, every HR complaint he'd been told to lose, every settlement agreement he'd been instructed to shred, 47 sealed settlements, 23 termination letters with fabricated causes, security footage from incidents Whitmore thought were erased, medical records from clinical trial participants who supposedly never existed. Robert had never spoken up. His family in Shanghai depended on his employment, on the health care Whitmore's compensation package provided, on the money he sent every month to support parents who were aging and a brother whose restaurant had failed. Speaking up meant losing everything, meant jeopardizing people thousands of miles away who relied on his silence. But he'd never stopped documenting. Every time Whitmore said, "Erase this," Robert kept a copy. Every time he witnessed cruelty, he recorded the date and details in careful handwriting. Every time power demonstrated its willingness to destroy vulnerable people, Robert preserved evidence that might someday matter. Now he watched through the window as Whitmore grabbed Maria's wrist, as violence escalated in the study, as another woman faced the choice between submission and consequences. And Robert's hand moved to the pocket of his gardening jacket, where he kept a key to the locked box in his shed, where 8 years of documentation waited for the right authority to finally arrive. In the service hallway on the mansion's second floor, Camila Rodriguez pressed herself against the wall, her small frame trying to become invisible, her hand covering her mouth to contain the sound she wanted to make but couldn't afford to release. She was 24 years old, from El Salvador, her immigration status uncertain enough that Whitmore had mentioned it twice during her 3 weeks of employment, never as a direct threat, but as an observation, a reminder that he knew her vulnerability and could exploit it whenever convenient. She'd started here 3 weeks ago. Maria had trained her, had shown her which products to use on which surfaces, had taught her the mansion's rhythms and Whitmore's preferences and the small strategies for avoiding his attention during his worst moods. Maria had been kind, had asked about Camila's family, had remembered her younger siblings' names, had offered advice that went beyond cleaning techniques. 2 days ago, Maria had left Camila a phone number, a sticky note pressed into her hand during a moment when Whitmore wasn't watching. "If you ever need help, call this number." Camila had kept the note, hadn't understood why at the time, had simply recognized that Maria was offering something important. Now she understood. Now she watched Maria maintain perfect composure while Whitmore grabbed her, shoved her, threatened her with the same tactics Camila had experienced at her previous job, where an employer had held immigration status over her like a blade, where she'd worked 60-hour weeks for $8 an hour and couldn't complain, because complaining meant deportation, meant never seeing her family again, meant failing the people who depended on her. Camila's eyes darted toward exits, the service staircase, the back door, the route she'd mapped during her first week, because mapping exits was survival instinct, was what you learned when you grew up with uncertainty, when safety was never guaranteed, and escape routes needed to be memorized before they were needed. But she didn't move. She watched. Her hands trembled. Her breathing came shallow. But some part of her, the part that had survived everything before this moment, recognized that something was different this time. That Maria wasn't just another woman being destroyed by power. That something else was happening beneath the surface. At the bottom of the main staircase, Maurice Williams stood with car keys clenched in his hand hard enough that the metal bit into his palm. He was 45 years old, an African-American man from Dorchester who'd driven Whitmore's Mercedes for 3 years, who knew every route between the Back Bay mansion and Prescient Pharmaceuticals offices in Cambridge, who'd sat in the front seat while Whitmore made phone calls and conducted business in the back, talking as if Morris's ears were decorative, as if drivers were furniture that occasionally moved. Maurice had a solid build, the frame of someone who'd played football in high school and still coached youth basketball at the community center in Dorchester. His eyes were careful, trained through years of observing without appearing to observe, of hearing without appearing to hear, of existing in spaces where his presence was required but his humanity was denied. He'd overheard everything. Business deals structured to avoid regulation. Threats made to employees who questioned practices. Racist comments Whitmore made to colleagues who laughed, who shared his assumptions, who believed their wealth and positions protected them from consequences. Maurice had heard Whitmore discuss Study 447, had listened to phone calls about altered autopsy reports, had been present for conversations that would end careers and result in prison sentences if they ever reached the right ears. Maurice was connected to community in ways Whitmore never understood. He was a deacon at his church, a coach at the youth center, a man people trusted and turned to for advice. He knew other drivers, other service workers, other people who moved through wealthy spaces while being treated as invisible. Information flowed through these networks, shared quietly over coffee, discussed in parking lots while waiting for employers, exchanged in knowing glances that communicated what couldn't be said aloud. His small resistance had been warning other drivers which families to avoid, which households treated staff with basic dignity, which employers saw service workers as human beings rather than possessions. He'd steered friends away from applying to work for Whitmore, had shared just enough information to protect people without exposing himself. Now he stood at the bottom of the stairs watching federal agents enter through the front door Morrison's team had opened, watching Whitmore's world end in the study above, watching justice arrive in the form of people with badges and authority and the legal power to finally make wealth answer for its crimes. His hand moved to his phone. He had calls to make. His pastor needed to know. The community organizer at Roxbury Tenants Alliance needed to know. His cousin at the Boston Globe needed to know. Word would spread through networks Whitmore never saw, never valued. Networks built on trust and shared experience and the understanding that sometimes the only power vulnerable people had was the power to witness and remember and tell the truth when the right moment finally arrived. Whitmore's final mistake was blocking Maria's path to the service exit. He moved to position himself between her and the doorway, his body language transforming from aggressive to predatory, his expression shifting from anger to something more calculated, more dangerous. One hand moved toward the desk drawer where he kept a Glock 19, never quite touching the handle, but hovering close enough to make the threat clear. His other hand gestured in the air, fingers jabbing, performing authority for an audience that had already stopped believing his performance. "You'll leave when I say." His voice dropped, meant to be menacing, achieving only desperation. "Maybe I don't let you leave at all." The threat was unmistakable now. This had moved beyond firing, beyond settlement checks and NDAs. This was Whitmore's paranoia reaching its logical endpoint, his terror that Maria represented exposure manifesting as violence that could escalate to something irreversible. Maria stated calmly, her voice carrying no aggression, no fear, just a clear boundary delivered with the force of someone who'd been trained to de-escalate situations exactly like this one. "I'm leaving now, Mr. Whitmore." She didn't reach for anything, didn't escalate, didn't move toward him or away. Her tactical positioning was perfect. Weight balanced on both feet. Exit route calculated. Body angled to protect vital organs. Hands visible and empty. Everything about her posture communicated non-threat while maintaining readiness. The paradox of someone trained to fight who chose restraint as their most powerful weapon. Whitmore struck before she could move. The slap came fast, open palm across her face, the sound echoing through the study like wood breaking. Maria's head turned with the impact, but her body didn't move, didn't stumble, didn't react beyond the involuntary response to physics. A red mark bloomed across her cheek, the handprint visible, the evidence clear. She didn't retaliate, didn't raise her hands, didn't even step back. She stood perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her expression empty of everything except the calculation running behind her eyes. Assault. Federal witness. Recorded. This seals his fate. The recording collar captured everything. Video and audio, time-stamped and encrypted, uploading in real time to servers that would be subpoenaed, examined, entered as evidence in federal court. Assault on a federal agent. Witness intimidation. Obstruction of justice. Charges that carried mandatory minimums, that couldn't be plea bargained away, that transformed Whitmore's situation from white-collar crime to violent felony. In the hallway, Devon stood frozen at the doorway, his serving tray clattering to the floor, silver and china shattering on marble, his eyes wide, his mouth open, his whole body rigid with shock and fear and the horrible certainty that he was watching something terrible and doing nothing to stop it. Camila remained pressed against the wall, her hand still over her mouth, tears running down her face, her body remembering every moment she'd been hit by men who believed their power made violence permissible. Through the window, Robert's pruning shears lowered completely. His expression remained neutral, controlled, but his jaw was clenched hard enough that muscle stood out in his neck. 8 years of documentation suddenly felt insufficient. 8 years of preserving evidence while watching people suffer suddenly felt like cowardice disguised as strategy. At the bottom of the stairs, Morris's car keys bit deeper into his palm. His other hand pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen, starting the calls that would spread word through communities Whitmore didn't know existed. The study door opened. Not security. Not the private firm Whitmore had on retainer. Not the off-duty Boston police officers who supplemented their salaries by providing protection to wealthy clients. Not the response he'd expected when he'd believed calling for help would bring people who worked for him. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Morrison stood in the doorway, her credentials held high, her badge catching light from the crystal chandelier. She was 43 years old, 20 years with the Bureau, her face showing nothing except professional competence and the absolute authority of federal law enforcement executing a lawful operation. Behind her, for agents in tactical gear, hands resting on holstered weapons, Glock 22s, standard FBI issue, body armor with police stenciled across the chest in reflective letters. Their faces calm, their movements controlled, their presence communicating that this wasn't a negotiation, wasn't a conversation, wasn't anything except a moment when Whitmore's belief in his own immunity met reality, and discovered that reality didn't care about his money or his connections or his certainty that consequences were for other people. Whitmore froze mid-threat. His hand, which had been moving toward the desk drawer, stopped in midair. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face cycled through expressions, confusion, disbelief, calculation, fear, each emotion visible for a moment before being replaced by the next, his control shattering in real time. What is this? His voice cracked on the last word, certainty fragmenting into uncertainty. I didn't call you. Who authorized you to enter my Morrison's voice cut through his objection with the flat authority of someone who'd delivered this speech dozens of times, who'd seen the same shock on dozens of faces, who understood that this moment was always terrible for the person being arrested and always necessary for the system that depended on accountability eventually arriving. Dr. Whitmore, I'm Special Agent Jennifer Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Maria turned from where she'd been standing, absorbing the blow, maintaining her cover for the final seconds it was necessary. When she spoke again, her entire presence transformed. Her shoulders came back, spine straightening, posture shifting from submissive to authoritative in the space of a breath. The accent she'd maintained for 6 months vanished completely, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of federal law enforcement, delivering charges, her words clear and final. Marcus Jonathan Whitmore, I'm Special Agent Maria Santos, FBI Financial Crimes and Healthcare Fraud Division. Whitmore's knees buckled. The man who'd terrorized 19 women, who'd grabbed wrists and screamed and threatened and hit, suddenly couldn't stand. 2 agents moved forward to catch him before his face struck the $40,000 Italian marble he'd imported to demonstrate wealth he'd earned through fraud and death. Maria continued, her voice clinical now, each charge delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent 6 months building a case file that would withstand every legal challenge Whitmore's expensive attorneys could mount. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, falsification of clinical trial data, obstruction of a federal investigation, and complicity in the wrongful deaths of 127 patients. She produced a USB drive from her cleaning cart's hidden compartment, the small device containing 6 months of evidence, thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours of audio and video, a complete record of criminal enterprise disguised as pharmaceutical innovation. 6 months of documented evidence. Every forged signature on trial protocols, every altered autopsy report, every offshore account in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama, all admissible in federal court, all witnessed by undercover federal agents. Morrison stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming in her hands, the metallic sound of them opening cutting through the study's heavy silence. The assault we just recorded? That's federal witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Your attorneys can't make federal charges disappear, Dr. Whitmore. They don't have jurisdiction where you're going. The agents lifted Whitmore to his feet. His expensive suit was wrinkled now, stained with sweat and fear. His carefully maintained hair had fallen across his forehead. His manicured hands trembled as Morrison fastened the handcuffs around his wrists, the metal cold against skin that had never felt anything colder than air conditioning set 2 degrees too low. Morrison began reading Miranda rights, each constitutional protection delivered in a voice that had performed this ritual so many times the words carried their own weight, their own gravity, their own finality. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The study that had been Whitmore's seat of power, the room where he'd built an empire, where he'd made decisions that killed people while calling it business, where he believed himself untouchable, became the room where everything ended. Surrounded by medical journals he'd never opened and humanitarian awards he didn't deserve, Marcus Whitmore learned that immunity was temporary and justice, however delayed, was eventually inevitable. Outside, forensic accountants were already entering through the front door Morrison's team had unlocked, carrying equipment that would inventory every asset, every account, every piece of art and furniture and expensive machinery that had been purchased with money earned through fraud. The Back Bay Mansion, the Gulfstream G650, the Nantucket Compound, the Manhattan Penthouse, all of it would be tagged as evidence, frozen by federal order, subject to forfeiture proceedings that would return pennies on the dollar to victims while demonstrating that even wealth this vast couldn't survive systematic criminality once federal attention finally arrived. The grandfather clock in the foyer continued ticking, marking time that no longer belonged to Marcus Whitmore, measuring moments he would spend in federal custody, counting down toward a future where his name would transform from respected innovator to cautionary tale, where his legacy would be measured not in patents or profits, but in the 127 lives ended by his greed and the justice that came too late to save them, but arrived in time to ensure he'd answer for every death, every lie, every moment he believed that power meant never having to face consequences for the harm he caused. Morrison's voice continued, clinical and precise, each word stripping away another layer of the power Whitmore had spent decades accumulating. We have federal warrants for 14 executives in Prescient Pharmaceuticals. Your CFO was arrested 2 hours ago at Logan International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Sao Paulo. Extradition treaty with Brazil ensures his return. Your director of clinical research is already cooperating fully, trading testimony for reduced sentence, providing complete access to Miami facility records. The scope was expanding in real time, each revelation demonstrating that this wasn't an isolated arrest, but the culmination of a coordinated federal operation spanning months, involving multiple agencies, targeting an entire network of corruption disguised as pharmaceutical innovation. Falsified trial data from your Miami facility has already been entered as evidence, Morrison continued. Shell corporations in Delaware are frozen by federal order. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama have all been flagged for seizure. Your real estate portfolio, the Back Bay Mansion, the Nantucket Compound, the Manhattan Penthouse, all of it has been tagged as evidence, all subject to federal forfeiture proceedings. Agent Santos stepped closer to where Whitmore sat collapsed in his leather desk chair, the same chair where he'd signed documents that killed people, where he'd made phone calls that destroyed lives, where he'd calculated profits in human suffering and convinced himself it was simply business. Her voice carried the weight of 6 months of documentation, 6 months of witnessing his cruelty while maintaining perfect cover, 6 months of building a case that would withstand every legal challenge his expensive attorneys could mount. The 19 women you terminated? We located every single one. They're all prepared to testify about the pattern of harassment, the threats, the hush money you used to buy their silence. Your sealed settlement agreements were unsealed this morning by federal court order. The NDAs you weaponized against vulnerable women, void under federal whistleblower protection statutes. The pattern is documented, Dr. Whitmore. This wasn't isolated incidents. This was systematic abuse of power. Outside, footsteps echoed through the mansion as forensic accountants entered through the front door Morrison's team had unlocked. They carried equipment designed to inventory every asset, every account, every piece of property purchased, with money earned through fraud and death. Asset freeze orders spanning 7 countries were already being executed. The Gulfstream G650 had a federal hold placed on it before Whitmore even knew he was under arrest. His art collection, the $12 million Basquiat, the Warhol, the Hockney pieces purchased at auction to demonstrate culture he didn't possess. All of it was now evidence, subject to seizure, destined for federal auction, with proceeds directed toward restitution for victims who'd never receive adequate compensation for what they'd lost. The pension fund for Prescient Pharmaceuticals employees had been protected, separated from personal assets, ensuring that the 2,400 people who'd worked for the company wouldn't lose their retirement because their CEO had built an empire on lies and altered death certificates. Whitmore's face had gone gray. His breathing came shallow and rapid, the physical manifestation of a man watching his entire world disintegrate in real time, watching 30 years of carefully constructed power collapse under the weight of evidence he believed would never surface because he'd paid the right people, threatened the right witnesses, controlled the right systems. He'd been wrong about all of it. That night, Devin Pierce couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bed in the fourth-floor staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, replaying the violence in his mind, the sound of the slap echoing through the study, Maria's absolute stillness in response, Whitmore's rage transforming into fear when federal agents arrived. The whole scene played on loop behind his eyes, refusing to fade into the background noise of exhaustion. His room was small, 10 feet by 12 feet, furnished with basics that Whitmore had provided because employing live-in staff was cheaper than paying enough for people to afford their own housing. The walls were thin enough that Devin could hear other staff members moving through the hallway, could hear the sounds of the mansion settling, could hear his own thoughts louder than he wanted. Student loans versus conscience. The equation had been simple for 4 months. He needed this job. $89,000 in debt from culinary school. This position paid $52,000 a year, which was decent money for someone just starting out, but barely enough to cover rent and loans and the money he sent his mother every month. Losing this job meant losing everything he'd worked toward, meant jeopardizing his ability to build the career he dreamed about since he was a teenager, watching cooking shows and imagining a future where he created something beautiful that nourished people. But lying in the darkness, the equation had changed. He kept thinking about his culinary school professor, Chef Rodriguez, who taught him that ethics weren't optional in professional kitchens, that how you treated people mattered as much as how you prepared food, that integrity was the foundation of everything else. Evidence only matters if it survives. The thought arrived fully formed, carrying the weight of responsibility Devin hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. At 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep. He dressed quietly, moving through the dark hallway toward the service stairs, descending to the kitchen that had been his domain for 4 months. The mansion was silent except for the grandfather clock's ticking, except for the hum of expensive appliances, except for Devin's heartbeat loud in his ears. The staff computer sat in a small office off the kitchen, used for ordering supplies, managing schedules, accessing the security system that Whitmore had installed throughout the mansion. Devin had the password, not because anyone had given it to him officially, but because Whitmore's arrogance extended to cybersecurity. The password was Whitmore 123, a combination so simple it would have been rejected by any system with basic security protocols, but sufficient for a man who believed his power made him immune to consequences. Devin's hands trembled as he logged in, as he navigated to the security footage archive, as he searched for today's date and the camera angle covering Whitmore's study. The footage auto-deleted every 72 hours, a security feature designed to prevent exactly what Devin was attempting. He had until Friday morning before today's evidence disappeared forever. The video loaded. He watched the whole scene again. Whitmore's panic after receiving the email, Maria vacuuming in the hallway with perfect timing, the confrontation escalating, the grab, the shove, the slap that echoed through 6 months of federal investigation. He watched Maria maintain her cover even as she was being assaulted, watched federal agents arrive with precision that suggested months of planning, watched Whitmore's world end in the room where he believed himself untouchable. Devin copied everything to an encrypted USB drive he kept in his chef's knife roll, the professional tools he'd purchased with scholarship money and part-time work, the knives he maintained with the same care he was now applying to preserving evidence. He deleted the access logs using IT skills learned at community college before culinary school, covering his tracks with thoroughness that surprised him. His internal monologue was clear now, stripped of the rationalizations that had kept him silent for 4 months. 17 women before Maria had no proof, no witnesses, no evidence that survived Whitmore's power and money. This time would be different. This time someone would make sure truth outlasted intimidation. When Devin left the kitchen an hour later, he stood straighter. His posture had changed, shoulders back instead of rounded, spine straight instead of defensive. This was the first time in his adult life he'd chosen principle over safety, chosen what was right over what was expedient, chosen to act despite fear instead of using fear as justification for inaction. Tomorrow morning, he would approach Agent Morrison and hand her the USB drive. Tonight he was discovering that courage felt different than he'd imagined. Not bold or dramatic, but quiet and determined and absolutely certain. The morning after Whitmore's arrest, Robertson approached the surveillance van that he'd watched for 6 months without acknowledging. The Comcast truck that had been parked 3 floors below the mansion since Maria Santos arrived. The federal presence he'd recognized immediately, because 12 years working for the Whitmore family had taught him to notice details that wealthy people missed. Agent Morrison was loading equipment, preparing to move the operation to its next location. She looked up as Robert approached, her expression professionally neutral, trained to reveal nothing until she understood what this encounter meant. Agent Morrison. Robert's voice was quiet, steady, carrying the calm of a man who'd waited 8 years for this moment. I have something you need to see. He carried a small fireproof box, the kind designed to protect documents during house fires, purchased 8 years ago when Robert had decided that if he couldn't speak truth to power directly, he could at least preserve truth for the moment when power finally faced accountability. Morrison's expression shifted, controlled shock giving way to focused attention. She gestured toward the van, toward privacy, toward the space where Robert could finally share secrets he'd carried alone for nearly a decade. Inside the van, Robert opened a box with hands that had tended gardens and buried evidence in equal measure. The contents represented 12 years of quiet resistance, 12 years of keeping copies when ordered to destroy, 12 years of documenting what Whitmore believed would disappear completely. 47 sealed settlement agreements, photographed before shredding, each one representing a woman who'd been paid to stay silent, each one containing allegations that ranged from verbal abuse to sexual harassment to physical assault. The agreements were legally binding, backed by attorneys who specialized in making problems disappear, enforced through threats that extended to immigration status and employment references, and the knowledge that fighting wealthy men with unlimited legal resources was a battle most people couldn't afford to wage. 23 termination letters with fabricated causes. Coffee too hot, vacuum too loud, windows cleaned with streaks. Reasons that sounded plausible in isolation but revealed a pattern when compiled. Whitmore targeted women of color, created impossible standards, documented failures that never actually occurred, and used his ownership of elite domestic services to ensure the fired women couldn't find work in any wealthy household in Boston. Security footage from 2018 through 2024, saved to personal drives that Whitmore didn't know existed. Robert had been responsible for maintaining the mansion's security system, for reviewing footage, for archiving or deleting recordings based on Whitmore's instructions. Every time he was told to delete something incriminating, he saved it first. Arguments with staff, threats delivered behind closed doors, moments of violence that Whitmore believed were erased from digital memory, emails Whitmore had ordered deleted, recovered from servers and printed before the data was purged, communications with Miami facility administrators about managing trial outcomes, messages to attorneys about neutralizing complainants, correspondence with accountants about optimizing offshore structures. The language was coded careful, designed to provide plausible deniability, but the meaning was clear when read in aggregate. Whitmore knew exactly what he was doing and took deliberate steps to conceal criminal activity behind layers of euphemism and corporate structure. Medical records from clinical trial participants who'd supposedly never existed. Robert had found these in trash designated for shredding, had recognized their significance even without understanding the medical terminology, had preserved them because something in his gut told him that evidence of human lives shouldn't be treated as disposable waste. Morrison examined each document with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 20 years building federal cases, who understood that evidence quality determined prosecution success, who recognized immediately that Robert's archive transformed a strong case into an overwhelming case. Mr. Chun. Morrison's voice carried respect earned through action rather than position. You may have saved lives. Future lives. The pattern you've documented here proves this wasn't aberrant behavior, but systematic criminality. This evidence will prevent plea bargains that minimize charges. This ensures accountability. Robert's response came quiet, weighted with years of second-guessing, years of wondering whether silence protected his family or enabled harm. I should have done it sooner. Morrison shook her head. You did it when external authority finally arrived. You waited for the right moment, the right jurisdiction, the right protection. That wasn't cowardice, Mr. Chun. That was strategy. And it worked. The weight Robert had carried for 8 years, the weight of knowing terrible things and not being able to stop them, the weight of documenting evidence while watching people suffer, the weight of choosing family security over immediate intervention. That weight shifted, not disappeared, but transformed into something else. Purpose instead of guilt, contribution instead of complicity. The knowledge that his quiet resistance had mattered, that his careful documentation would ensure Whitmore faced consequences for every crime, that silence had been tactical rather than permanent. When Robert left the surveillance van 20 minutes later, Morrison had his contact information, his testimony scheduled, his archive entered into federal evidence logs. The pattern was documented now, official and irrefutable. Marcus Whitmore hadn't made mistakes or exercised poor judgment. He'd operated a criminal enterprise for more than a decade, protected by wealth and connections and the reasonable belief that vulnerable people wouldn't risk everything to challenge him. Robert had proved that belief wrong. One patient gardener with weathered hands and 8 years of documentation had helped federal agents build a case that would put Whitmore in prison for the rest of his life. The night of Whitmore's arrest, Camila Rodriguez sat in her small 4th-floor room, holding the phone number Maria had pressed into her hand 3 weeks ago, hand shaking so badly she could barely dial. The sticky note had been hidden inside her cleaning supply cart, discovered during training that felt like it had happened years ago instead of weeks. If you ever need help, call this number. Maria's handwriting was precise, the numbers clear, the message simple. At the time, Camila hadn't understood. Now, watching federal agents take Whitmore away in handcuffs, watching Maria transform from submissive housekeeper to commanding federal agent, the meaning crystallized. Maria had known exactly what she was doing, had been building a case while training Camila, had left this number as a lifeline for the moment when everything changed. Camila dialed. Her phone showed low battery. She'd forgotten to charge it, too focused on surviving each day to think about tomorrow's needs. The call connected after 2 rings. FBI Field Office, Victim Services. Como puedo ayudar? The voice was female, warm, speaking Spanish with the fluency of someone for whom the language was home rather than skill. Camila's story poured out in fragments, in the mixture of Spanish and English that arrived when fear made careful language impossible. She'd witnessed today's assault, seen Whitmore grab Maria, shove her, strike her, heard the threats about immigration status that Whitmore had used against Camila herself, the casual mentions of knowing people at IC, the suggestions that reporting anything would result in deportation, separation from family, consequences that extended far beyond losing a job. She described the wage theft, $8 per hour for 60-hour weeks, paid in cash with no records, no overtime, no legal documentation that would allow her to claim what she was owed. She described the sexual comments, the invasive questions about her body and her relationships and her private life, questions that made her skin crawl, but that she'd answered, because refusing meant risking everything. The agent on the phone listened without interrupting, without judgment, with the professional compassion of someone trained to help traumatized witnesses navigate systems designed to protect them. When Camila finished, exhausted and crying, the agent's response transformed fear into possibility. Camila, you're not in trouble. He is. Federal witness protection is available if you need it. We have immigration attorneys who work with our office, provided at no cost to you. Your back wages can be calculated and recovered through federal prosecution. And most importantly, your testimony matters. It helps establish the pattern. It helps ensure he faces accountability for everything he did, to you and to others. Camila's posture changed over the course of that phone call. She was sitting straighter by the end, spine finding strength it had forgotten during 3 weeks of living in fear. This was the first time in her life an authority figure had protected her instead of threatened her, had treated her testimony as valuable instead of dangerous, had made her safety the priority instead of treating her as collateral damage. She would give a formal statement tomorrow. She would work with the immigration attorney to address her status. She would claim the wages Whitmore had stolen, and she would call her mother in El Salvador with words she'd never imagined being able to say. "I'm safe now." Someone listened. Someone helped. Justice arrived. The transformation from survival to testimony, from fear to agency, from silence to truth-telling. It happened in one phone call, facilitated by a sticky note from an undercover federal agent who'd understood that providing resources was as important as gathering evidence. Camila fell asleep that night with her phone charging, with the victim services number saved in her contacts, with the knowledge that tomorrow would be different because she'd chosen to speak instead of disappearing into the silence that had protected Whitmore for so many years. Maurice Williams watched the federal arrest from his position in the driver's seat of Whitmore's Mercedes, parked in the circular driveway where 3 black Chevy Suburbans now blocked any possibility of exit. He watched agents walk Whitmore out of the mansion in handcuffs, watched the man who'd called him boy yesterday stumble on his own Traverton steps, watched Maria Santos, the woman who'd always said please and thank you, even when asking for simple things, stand with the posture and authority of federal law enforcement. Maurice connected the dots immediately. She'd never been just a housekeeper. The way she'd moved through spaces, the way she'd observed without seeming to observe, the way she'd asked questions that seemed casual but revealed tactical thinking. He noticed these things without understanding their significance. Now everything made sense. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls that would spread information through networks Whitmore had never known existed, through communities built on trust and shared experience and the understanding that sometimes the only power vulnerable people had was the power to witness and tell the truth. First call, Pastor Williams at Dorchester AME Church. "Pastor, you need to know what happened today. Marcus Whitmore was arrested by the FBI. Federal charges. Healthcare fraud, witness intimidation, systematic abuse." Pastor Williams' response was immediate. The congregation would be informed. 400 members, many working in domestic service throughout Boston's wealthy neighborhoods. Word would spread through that network within hours. The FBI was running undercover operations in wealthy homes. The woman cleaning your employer's study might be documenting crimes. Justice was possible, even for people who'd been told their testimony didn't matter. Second call, community organizer at Roxbury Tenants Alliance. "Whitmore's been arrested. Federal charges for everything we tried to report 5 years ago." The organizer's response carried vindication and frustration in equal measure. "Finally, we filed complaints with the police, with the state medical board, with everyone who was supposed to care. They all protected him. Took federal agents to make it stick." The Tenants Alliance would organize, would reach out to Whitmore's former employees, would coordinate testimony and support and the collective action that transformed isolated victims into a movement demanding accountability. Third call, Morris's cousin at the Boston Globe, city desk. "I have a story for you. Real journalism, not tabloid. FBI just arrested Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Prescient Pharmaceuticals. I've been his driver for 3 years. I've heard things. I can connect you with other staff members. This is bigger than one arrest. This is about systematic abuse of power in Boston's wealthiest households, about how service workers become invisible to people who should see them as human. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Information flowed through channels Whitmore had never valued enough to control. Drivers talking to other drivers at gas stations and parking garages. Housekeepers sharing information at bus stops and grocery stores. Cooks exchanging stories at markets and supply shops. Nannies connecting through playgrounds and schools. All of them talking, all of them aware. Someone was finally watching the people who believed they were unwatched. The power structure that depended on invisibility and silence was exposed, fragile, vulnerable to scrutiny it had avoided through arrogance and institutional capture. Morris's transformation was complete. From isolated observer to active connector. From someone who witnessed injustice while feeling powerless to someone who understood that community knowledge was power, that networks built on trust could accomplish what individuals couldn't achieve alone, that information distributed through informal channels could create accountability when formal systems failed. By nightfall, before the story hit major news outlets, before Whitmore's arrest became public record, hundreds of people in Boston's service worker communities already knew. The FBI had taken down one of the city's most powerful men, using an undercover agent who'd posed as a housekeeper for 6 months, building a case while being treated as invisible by someone who'd forgotten that invisible didn't mean powerless. The word spreading through those communities wasn't celebration. It was awareness, the understanding that justice was possible, that documentation mattered, that speaking truth could lead to accountability instead of retaliation, that the systems meant to protect people sometimes worked, even if they worked slowly and imperfectly, and only after tremendous effort by people who refused to accept that power meant immunity from consequences. Morrison continued reading Whitmore his Miranda rights in the study, where he'd built an empire on fraud, surrounded by medical journals he'd never opened and humanitarian awards he didn't deserve. Each constitutional protection landed with the weight of ritual, the weight of a legal system that moved slowly but arrived eventually, the weight of individual rights that applied even to men who'd violated the rights of 127 people whose deaths he'd concealed for profit. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Whitmore could afford a dozen attorneys, had 3 on permanent retainer at nearly $1,000 per hour, had built his defense strategy around the assumption that unlimited legal resources could outlast any prosecution. He'd been right about that assumption in local jurisdictions, where his political connections and financial contributions had redirected investigations before they gained momentum. But federal jurisdiction operated differently. The FBI didn't answer to Boston's police chief, whose daughter worked in Whitmore's legal department. Federal prosecutors didn't depend on campaign contributions from shell corporations Whitmore controlled. The attorneys who'd made his problems disappear for decades had no power in federal court beyond the same advocacy available to any defendant, wealthy or poor. Whitmore sat collapsed in his leather desk chair, the same chair where he'd signed falsified trial protocols, the same chair where he'd approved payments to silence victims, the same chair where he'd calculated that 127 deaths were acceptable losses in pursuit of FDA approval and $43 million in annual compensation. His breathing came rapid and shallow, his face gray, his hands trembling. The life he'd built on stolen research and altered death certificates was crumbling with every constitutional syllable Morrison delivered. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you? Whitmore nodded, unable to speak, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening, unable to access the arrogance that had sustained him through decades of criminal enterprise disguised as pharmaceutical innovation. The agents lifted him to his feet. The handcuffs were visible on his wrists, the metal cold against skin accustomed to Italian wool and silk, the physical constraint foreign to a man who'd moved through the world, believing his wealth made him immune to the limitations that governed ordinary people. His expensive watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people earned in a year, remained attached to his wrist, a symbol of wealth that no longer meant anything, that couldn't buy his freedom or erase his crimes, or reverse the moment when his belief in his own immunity met the reality of federal accountability. They walked him through the mansion he'd never see again, past the grandfather clock that had marked time while he terrorized staff, past the Basquiat that would be seized as evidence, past the imported marble that would be photographed and inventoried and eventually auctioned to compensate victims who'd never receive adequate restitution for what they'd lost. Every room held memories of power exercised without conscience, of wealth accumulated without regard for human cost, of a life built on the assumption that money could purchase immunity from consequences. In the hallway, Whitmore caught his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows he'd installed to display his mansion to Commonwealth Avenue's passing traffic. He was still wearing his $3,000 suit, wrinkled now and stained with sweat. His carefully maintained hair had fallen across his forehead. His face looked older suddenly, power visibly drained, leaving behind only the aging man who'd been hiding beneath expensive grooming and pharmaceutical cocktails and the constant performance of authority. The household staff stood in the foyer, silent witnesses to the moment power finally met consequence. Devin Pierce stood with tears on his cheeks, crying not for Whitmore but for relief, for the validation that choosing principle over safety had mattered. Robertson stood with his hands folded, his expression peaceful, carrying the knowledge that 8 years of quiet documentation had contributed to this moment. Camila Rodriguez pressed against the wall, her hand over her heart, watching a man who terrorized her reduced to the criminal he'd always been beneath the veneer of respectability. Maurice Williams stood at the bottom of the stairs, car keys in hand, ready to drive anyone except Whitmore, ready to spread word through communities that justice had arrived. They weren't celebrating. They weren't gloating. They were simply witnessing, bearing silent testimony to accountability that had taken too long, but arrived nonetheless, marking this moment as proof that power wasn't absolute, that silence wasn't permanent, that systems could work even when they'd failed repeatedly before. The staff didn't ask Maria who she really was, didn't demand explanations or express betrayal at the deception. They understood implicitly. She'd been there to help, had been building a case while living among them, had maintained her cover, even as she'd offered small kindnesses that revealed her essential humanity beneath the federal agent persona. Quiet nods were exchanged. No debt was created, just acknowledgement. Everyone had played their part in ensuring this time would be different. This time truth would outlast intimidation. Outside, news vans were already arriving, called by Morris's cousin at the Globe, positioning cameras at the mansion's gates, preparing to broadcast the perp walk that would transform Whitmore's name from respected innovator to cautionary tale. By dawn, footage of his arrest would play on every news channel. By the end of the week, his face would be synonymous with pharmaceutical fraud, corporate greed, the abuse of power that characterized America's wealthiest households when they believed no one was watching. The black Chevy Suburban departed the mansion with Whitmore in the back seat, flanked by agents on both sides, their presence ensuring he couldn't flee or harm himself or attempt any of the desperate actions people sometimes took when everything they'd built dissolved in a single day. The destination was the John Joseph Moakley Federal Courthouse in South Boston, where the machinery of federal justice would process him with the same methodical efficiency applied to every defendant, regardless of wealth or status or previous belief in their own immunity. Processing was deliberate and dehumanizing in the way all bureaucratic systems are dehumanizing. Fingerprints taken, mugshot photographed, personal belongings cataloged and stored, civilian clothing exchanged for orange jumpsuit that eliminated the visual markers of wealth and status. The federal system didn't care about Whitmore's local connections, didn't care that police chiefs and judges and politicians had protected him for decades, didn't care that he'd spent his life moving through spaces where his name opened doors and his money solved problems. Here he was defendant number 2024 CR, one 0392 DJC. One case among thousands, processed with the same procedures applied to everyone who entered federal custody. The bail hearing occurred the next morning before a federal magistrate judge who'd reviewed the prosecution's filing overnight, who understood the scope of charges, who'd seen enough wealthy defendants claim community ties and surrender passports while maintaining offshore accounts and private jets that could facilitate flight to non-extradition countries. The prosecution's arguments were straightforward and devastating. Flight risk based on private aircraft and offshore financial resources, danger to witnesses based on documented history of intimidation, severity of charges based on 127 deaths and $400 million in fraud. The prosecutor was young, maybe 35, a career federal attorney who'd built cases against corporate criminals and understood that wealth made defendants more dangerous, not less, because they had resources to flee and incentive to eliminate anyone who might testify against them. Whitmore's defense team, 3 attorneys from a white shoe firm that charged $950 per hour and specialized in representing pharmaceutical executives accused of regulatory violations, presented the standard arguments for bail. Pillar of community, no prior criminal record, willing to surrender passport, extensive local ties that would prevent flight. They emphasized his charitable contributions, his role in developing medications that had helped patients, his cooperation with the investigation. The arguments were competent but unconvincing. The judge's ruling came after 15 minutes of deliberation. The court finds clear and convincing evidence that the defendant poses both a flight risk and a danger to the community. Bail is denied. The defendant is remanded to custody pending trial. The gavel fell. Final. Irrevocable. Whitmore would spend the months before trial in the federal detention center, awaiting a legal process that moved with deliberate slowness, that granted defendants every constitutional protection, while grinding toward a conclusion that statistics suggested was nearly inevitable. The federal conviction rate hovered around 93%, higher for cases with the quantity and quality of evidence Santos and Morrison had compiled. That first night in federal detention, Whitmore shared a cell with 2 other defendants awaiting trial. The accommodations were Spartan: concrete walls, steel bunks, fluorescent lighting that never fully darkened, the constant noise of facility, housing hundreds of people in close quarters. No private accommodations. No special treatment. No acknowledgement of his previous status or wealth or belief that he deserved different conditions than everyone else. The man who'd controlled a mansion now controlled nothing. Not his schedule, not his environment, not his future. Other inmates recognized him from news coverage, whispered about the rich doctor who'd killed patients, and thought he'd get away with it. There was no protection from reputation here. No attorneys who could make social consequences disappear. No money that could purchase the respect he'd commanded in spaces where wealth determined value. His legal team filed emergency motions within 48 hours, suppressed evidence based on claims that the undercover operation violated his rights, dismissed charges based on jurisdiction arguments, transfer venue based on claims that Boston media coverage had poisoned the jury pool. Every motion was denied. The evidence was legally obtained through a lawful FBI operation. Federal jurisdiction was clear based on interstate fraud and healthcare violations. Media coverage reflected public interest in a matter of legitimate concern, not bias that would prevent fair trial. Reality was setting in. The attorneys began discussing plea bargains, trying to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, trying to minimize prison time that now seemed inevitable rather than avoidable. But the prosecution had 14 cooperating witnesses from Prescient Pharmaceuticals' executive team, had complete documentation from Santos's 6-month operation, had testimony from 19 women Whitmore had terrorized, had Robert's 8-year archive, had everything they needed to prove every charge beyond reasonable doubt. The plea discussions went nowhere. Federal prosecutors didn't need Whitmore's cooperation when they had overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses. The trial would proceed. likely within 18 months, and the outcome was statistically predetermined. The mansion sat empty the day after Whitmore's arrest, evidence teams working through the night to photograph and inventory and catalog everything that might be relevant to federal prosecution or asset forfeiture. Yellow tape crossed the entrance, the kind of barrier usually associated with crime scenes, which this was, in a sense, a crime scene where a criminal enterprise had operated for years while masquerading as legitimate business, where wealth had insulated wrongdoing from scrutiny, where power had protected itself through systems designed to serve justice, but captured by the people they were meant to constrain. The household staff had been released from employment with back wages paid by federal order, the money drawn from Whitmore's frozen accounts, ensuring that people who'd worked for him received compensation they'd earned regardless of what happened to his assets during forfeiture proceedings. Devin received 4 months of back wages, plus overtime he'd never been paid. Robert received 12 years of properly calculated vacation time and retirement contributions. Camila received the difference between what she'd been paid and what she should have earned under Massachusetts minimum wage laws, plus damages for wage theft. They collected their belongings from fourth-floor rooms they'd never see again, walking through spaces that had felt oppressive when Whitmore controlled them, but felt almost peaceful now that his presence was gone, now that the fear he'd cultivated had dissipated like smoke when the source was removed. Back Bay's atmosphere shifted in the days following the arrest. The wealthy neighborhood that had always maintained polite distance from its service workers suddenly engaged in small conversations at bus stops, at markets, at churches. Other wealthy homeowners were worried, wondering if the FBI might be running other undercover operations, if their own households might be under surveillance, if their treatment of staff might invite federal attention. Domestic workers were hopeful, discussing among themselves whether this moment represented real change or isolated accountability, whether other employers might reform their practices out of fear or genuine recognition that how they treated people mattered. Elite Domestic Services came under immediate federal investigation, Whitmore's ownership exposed, the company's role in facilitating his abuse of workers documented through email records and testimony from agency employees who'd been ordered to blacklist women who'd complained about working conditions. Workers began organizing, demanding written contracts instead of informal agreements, demanding protections against arbitrary termination, demanding fair wages and overtime and the basic dignity that employment law promised, but that many wealthy households avoided through cash payments and intimidation. Other staffing agencies scrambled to implement worker protections, terrified that FBI undercover operations might become standard practice, that any new hire might be a federal agent documenting violations, that the invisibility of service workers might conceal law enforcement presence. Prescient Pharmaceuticals stock trading was halted on NASDAQ within hours of Whitmore's arrest. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, appointed an interim CEO, issued a public statement promising full cooperation with federal investigation while trying to distance the company from its founder's criminal activity. The stock price collapsed 87% in one day, wiping out billions in shareholder value, destroying retirement accounts and investment portfolios and the wealth that had been built on falsified trial data and concealed deaths. 2,400 employees faced uncertain futures. Many had believed they were working for a company that developed life-saving medications, that contributed to public health, that operated within legal and ethical boundaries. Learning that their employer had killed 127 people and concealed the deaths for profit was devastating, demoralizing, destabilizing to people who'd built careers on assumptions that proved false. The Massachusetts Attorney General opened a state investigation running parallel to federal charges, examining whether Prescient had violated state consumer protection laws, whether Whitmore had defrauded investors, whether other executives bore criminal liability beyond the 14 already facing federal charges. The FDA began reviewing all drugs approved based on Prescient's clinical trials, suspending medications pending independent verification of safety data, prioritizing patient protection over corporate profits or regulatory efficiency. Medical journals retracted studies Whitmore had published, removing fraudulent research from scientific literature, issuing corrections that acknowledged the publications had been based on falsified data. The retractions cascaded through pharmaceutical research, calling into question every study that had cited Whitmore's work, undermining conclusions that had seemed settled, revealing how corruption in one corner of research could contaminate entire fields. Families of the 127 patients who died or suffered catastrophic adverse events in Study 447 were contacted by victim services, offered counseling and support and information about the federal prosecution and the class action wrongful death lawsuit that had been filed within 72 hours of Whitmore's arrest. Many families hadn't known their loved ones had died in a clinical trial. The death certificates listed natural causes or complications from pre-existing conditions, concealing the role prescient's experimental drug had played in deaths that should have been reported to the FDA and instead were buried beneath falsified autopsy reports and cash settlements. The silence was finally broken. 17 women who'd been terminated by Whitmore and paid to stay quiet began coming forward, their stories published in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Post. The pattern documented nationally, systematic abuse spanning more than a decade, protected by NDAs and settlement agreements, and the reasonable fear that fighting wealthy men with unlimited legal resources meant losing everything. But federal prosecution had voided the NDAs under whistleblower protection statutes, and suddenly women who'd carried secrets for years could speak truth without legal consequences. Other pharmaceutical executives across the country were sweating, wondering if their own practices would survive scrutiny, if their own clinical trials would withstand audit, if their own treatment of employees and research subjects would meet legal and ethical standards if examined by federal agents with subpoena power and 6 months to build comprehensive cases. The ripple effects of one arrest spread through industries and communities and regulatory systems that had become comfortable with corporate power operating above meaningful constraint, that had accepted wealth as insulation from accountability, that had treated service workers and clinical trial participants and anyone without power as disposable when their suffering threatened profit. Marcus Whitmore's arrest became an inflection point, the moment when one particularly egregious example of criminal enterprise met institutional justice and demonstrated that systems could work, imperfectly and belatedly, and only after tremendous effort by people who refused to accept that power meant immunity, but systems could work nonetheless. 3 days after the arrest, Maria Santos returned to Back Bay wearing civilian clothes, driving an unremarkable sedan instead of the bus she'd taken during her 6 months undercover. She parked across the street from Whitmore's mansion, far enough that she didn't appear to be loitering, close enough to observe the building she'd occupied for half a year. The evidence tape still crossed the entrance. The windows were empty, no movement visible inside, the building dormant in a way that made it look abandoned despite being worth $12 million. Maria felt no need to enter, no desire to revisit spaces where she'd performed submission while documenting crimes. The work was complete. The case file was sealed and submitted. This chapter was closed. She sat in the parked car removing recording equipment from the surveillance van that had been her team's base of operations for 6 months, powering down systems that had captured thousands of hours of audio and video, packing away technology that had documented everything from casual cruelty to federal crimes. Her encrypted tablet showed the case file status: complete, forwarded to prosecution, scheduled for trial in approximately 18 months, depending on court availability and plea negotiation outcomes. Below the Whitmore file, 14 other names glowed in the active investigation queue. 14 more operations running simultaneously across the country: Seattle, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, Miami, Philadelphia, San Diego, Denver, Minneapolis, Nashville, Portland, Austin. 14 more estates. 14 more wealthy men who believed their power made them immune to observation and accountability. 14 more undercover agents posing as housekeepers, nannies, executive assistants, personal trainers, gathering evidence with the same patient methodology Maria had employed in Boston. She didn't seek thanks or recognition or closure. The FBI didn't do victory laps. Agents completed assignments professionally and moved to the next operation, understanding that individual cases were components of broader efforts to establish that law applied equally regardless of wealth, that justice arrived slowly but arrived nonetheless, that systematic documentation and institutional prosecution could eventually overcome the advantages money provided to people who believed they were above consequences. The work was never about personal satisfaction. It was about building cases that would withstand legal challenges, about gathering evidence that would prove criminal activity beyond reasonable doubt, about ensuring that when the moment arrived to execute warrants and make arrests, everything was prepared, documented, irrefutable. Maria's phone rang. Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Seattle assignment approved. Tech CEO, venture capital fund. Thinks his smart home security is impenetrable. Doesn't know the home automation company cooperates with federal investigations. Doesn't know his new house manager has digital forensics training. Maria's response was immediate, professional, carrying no hesitation or need for rest or acknowledgement that 6 months of undercover work deserved recovery time. When do I start? 2 weeks. Enough time to prepare backstory, establish credentials, get the house manager position through their staffing agency. This was the work, patient, invisible, relentless, moving from one operation to the next, becoming different people in different cities, maintaining cover while gathering evidence, living dual lives where surface identity performed submission while core identity pursued justice through systematic documentation and institutional prosecution. As Maria prepared to leave, Devin Pierce exited the mansion's service entrance, carrying the last of his belongings in a duffel bag, his chef's knife roll slung over his shoulder. He'd been collecting his things, closing out a chapter that had lasted only 4 months, but taught him more about courage and compromise and the cost of silence than culinary school had taught him about cooking. He saw Maria across the street in the parked car. Their eyes met across the distance. No words were exchanged. The street was too wide for conversation. And besides, what needed to be communicated required no language. Devin's hand moved to his chest, a gesture somewhere between acknowledgement and gratitude, somewhere between respect and solidarity. He nodded slowly, deliberately, his whole body communicating understanding. Intervention had mattered. Documentation had mattered. The choice to act instead of staying silent had mattered. Maria returned the nod slightly, the gesture minimal, professional, acknowledging Devin's role without creating debt or obligation. 17 women before Maria had faced Whitmore's abuse without witnesses, without evidence, without anyone who chose documentation over self-preservation. Devin had ensured this time was different. His security footage, handed to Morrison the morning after the arrest, had provided corroboration for federal charges, had established timeline and pattern, had been one piece among thousands that built a comprehensive case that made Whitmore's conviction statistically inevitable. Mutual understanding passed between them. They'd both done what was right when what was right required courage. No conversation was needed. No thanks were necessary. No debt was created. Just acknowledgement. Some moments demand we choose between safety and principle, and sometimes people surprise themselves by choosing principle even when the cost feels unbearable. Maria didn't linger, didn't wave, didn't prolong the moment beyond the acknowledgement it deserved. The work here was never about staying, never about relationships or recognition, never about anything except completing the assignment professionally and moving to the next operation where patience and documentation might again create accountability where power had previously operated unchecked. She started the car's engine. November rain was beginning to fall, drops hitting the windshield with the soft percussion that marked seasonal transition in New England, weather moving from autumn's cold clarity toward winter's frozen weight. The rain would continue through the afternoon, would wash the streets, would make the city look clean despite everything dirty that happened in spaces where wealth believed itself immune to observation. Morrison's call came through on the car's Bluetooth system as Maria merged into Boston traffic. Seattle CEO's name is Jonathan Reeves. Made his fortune in cloud computing security. The irony isn't lost on us. Venture capital fund specializes in tech startups, 40 companies in his portfolio. Net worth estimated at $800 million. Lives in Medina, the neighborhood where Gates and Bezos have estates. Smart home, completely automated. Security, climate control, lighting, entertainment, all running through systems his own company designed. What's the vulnerability? Maria's question was professional, tactical, focused on the operational details that would determine whether this assignment was viable. The home automation company is cooperating with federal investigation. They've been documenting unusual security protocols Reeves implemented. Cameras in staff quarters, audio recording in private spaces, data collection that violates Washington privacy laws. We suspect he's using the smart home technology to monitor and control household staff. Several former employees have filed complaints about invasive surveillance and workplace harassment. And my cover, house manager position. Reeves uses an agency in Seattle similar to Elite Domestic Services, not owned by him directly, but heavily influenced through board connections. We've already established your credentials. Former hospitality management at a resort in Hawaii. Excellent references. Specialized training in managing high-tech households. The agency thinks they've found the perfect candidate. He thinks he's hiring someone who'll manage his estate efficiently while being too intimidated by his wealth and technology to question anything she observes. Maria smiled slightly. The pattern was consistent. Wealthy men hired service workers through agencies they controlled, believing economic leverage ensured compliance, never considering that the perfect candidate might possess credentials that were real but backgrounds that were constructed. 2 weeks for preparation. I'll be ready. The rain intensified as she drove through Boston streets, past neighborhoods where wealth and poverty existed in close proximity, but rarely intersected, where service workers traveled from Roxbury and Dorchester to clean homes in Back Bay and Beacon Hill. 14 more operations running simultaneously. 14 more women moving through wealthy spaces while gathering evidence. Justice didn't rest, didn't pause between victories, didn't treat individual prosecutions as endpoints, but as components of broader efforts to establish that law constrained everyone or no one. Maria's car disappeared into traffic, heading toward an FBI field office, where she'd spend 2 weeks preparing for Seattle, studying Jonathan Reeves's background, memorizing smart home technology, practicing the performance of competent house manager while documenting everything for federal prosecution. The work continued. Patient, invisible, relentless. Sometimes we wait for justice to arrive with sirens and spectacle, with immediate consequences and dramatic confrontations. But real justice often wears a housekeeper's uniform and answers, "Yes, sir," while building a federal case. It vacuums hallways while recording crimes. It folds laundry while photographing documents. Maria Santos spent 6 months being invisible, not because she was weak, but because invisibility was her greatest weapon, her tactical advantage, the position from which she could observe without triggering the defensive responses that wealth deploys when it perceives threats. The rich and powerful make one fatal mistake. They believe the people who serve them don't matter. They talk freely in front of drivers, discuss criminal activity near housekeepers, abuse assistants, and gardeners, believing economic vulnerability ensures silence, that power creates immunity. They forget that invisible people have eyes and ears. They forget that some of those invisible people carry federal badges and spend months gathering evidence while performing submission so perfectly that wealth never recognizes the threat until handcuffs close. Devin, Robert, Camila, and Maurice won because they documented when they could have stayed silent, preserved evidence when destruction was easier, testified when silence was safer. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things quietly until their courage became components of federal prosecution. In your own life, you might be the person everyone underestimates. Remember, being underestimated is sometimes an advantage. Those who don't see you coming can't prepare for your arrival. Quiet integrity still carries weight. Patient documentation still builds cases. If this story moved you, subscribe now. Share this with anyone who's ever been made invisible. Remind them that invisibility can be choice, tactic, power,